What I wanted to talk about today, I've sort of loosely assembled, I guess what you could say is sort of a collection of notes, somewhere between a collection of notes and like the skeleton of potentially an essay around Cedric Price and the sort of understanding Cedric Price around Lucius Burckhardt and his notion of strollology. I've loosely titled the talk, The Urbanization of Architecture, the 1,000 Machines of Cedric Price, and I'll explain that title in a little while. But I think I want to just depart from the initial provocation put together for the Swiss Pavilion this year by Hans-Ulrich Obrist, the idea of a stroll through the Fun Palace. What could that possibly mean, and what questions does it provoke? Obviously, it's interesting as a curatorial strategy to construct an event that unfolds in time and space around Cedric Price's work and imagining the idea of strolling through not only the pavilion itself, but through the ideas and spaces that Price had imagined. So I'm not some kind of an expert on Burckhardt's work. But obviously, I mean, we can all contextualize the notion of the stroll, his idea of strollology, around many of the experimental practices of the last century. Things tied up with even notions from the late 19th century of the flaneur, to things like the situationist dérive, to psychogeography, etc. And I think all of which outline a sort of phenomenological politics of urban space. And I think there's a sort of fascination that we've had with the stroll, the promenade, and so forth, both from a kind of passive bourgeois act to a more politicized and intentional practice. So I'm not, I have to say, terribly interested in the whole politics of subversion that is embedded in many practices of the dérive and so forth. I mean, I think they've had a certain place in history that's very important, because I think they're today a less effective form of politics. I think at this point, the notion of the stroll, the notion of the dérive, has already been kind of captured by larger capitalist forms of urbanization and incorporated as part of the planning almost of the city. You're supposed to sort of run into things and a sort of aimless walk through the city. That's how we consume today. But I think what's interesting about the notion of the stroll and all of these forms of politics is because they all highlight, whether wittingly or unwittingly, a kind of immensely important activity of modernity, namely circulation. And this, for me, as I mentioned, is a very important part of my own research, looking at the history of circulation and the political notion of circulation itself. So, when we talk about the stroll, historically, where does the stroll begin and where does the promenade begin, and so forth. And obviously, we would tend to think of the stroll and the promenade and the dérive and all these kinds of things as having their roots in sort of 19th century as a sort of object of a sort of socio-aesthetic practice of contemplation and alienation, if you want, all of which were somehow we can relate to Baudelaire and his work in Paris, the boulevards of Paris, and the new experiences of the crowd and the experiential space of the boulevards of Haussmann and so forth. All of this, for me, is indicative of a general moment in history that the history of architecture would tend to classify as the rise of the modern city or the rise of modern town planning. And for me, this is a very interesting moment. I mean, I think it's a very interesting moment for many people. But the way I'm looking at this is somehow to move a bit beyond the romantic notion that we might have. And in fact, I think the stroll in general and all of these various practices I mentioned are somehow burdened, even if they try not to be, with a sense of romance. Even the more politically subversive ones, I'd say, are somehow burdened by a romantic notion. So I'd like to move beyond that. And in that sense, I'd like to connect the idea of the boulevard, the promenade, the stroll, and so forth, with a more general rise of circulation as a kind of predominant category of activity and of organization and strategies and so forth that really takes place in the 19th century in Europe and in the Americas, mainly North America, during the 19th century. Basically looking at how the rise of circulation as this predominant category also gives rise to a radically new space that began to unfold throughout this period. And this, for me, I would call the urban. So this transformation that I'm discussing here, the rise of circulation and the subsequent rise of the urban, is something which is typically eschewed by modern and contemporary histories of architecture and of the city, which, because they tend to favor an art historical perspective, they seem to view this as more of a period whose coherence is generally given by coherent forms of style or recognizable forms of style, materials that can be applied to history and to understanding history. For me, I think, one thing that a problem that we tend to face today is that we are not able to understand this notion of the urban or urbanization as such. I think we tend to believe, everyone tends to believe they know what we mean when we talk about the urban or urbanization. But I think we often tend to mistake it for other things. And for me, this is a central, again, object of my own research and something I'd like to try to clarify a little bit today in a very quick way, I suppose. So for me, the rise of the urban or of urbanization is something that we can talk about when we think about, Haussmann's Paris, of course. That's a prime example. But much more important and much more paradigmatic than Haussmann is the much less well-known figure of Ildefonso Cerdà, who is, of course, the figure who designed the master plan of Barcelona, the plan of reform and extension of Barcelona, as it was called, in 1857. And basically, accompanying with that is a general theory of urbanization that he puts out, he publishes in 1867. And this, for me, is a far more important moment in history than either Haussmann's Paris or even the plan that was set in place through Cerdà. So just to very briefly go through some of his theses that he puts forward in his general theory of urbanization. First of all, it's all based on this notion that he calls vialidad, which is loosely translated as circulation or traffic, but for him it meant almost something of a theological or almost like a transcendental category of movement. It was something that underpinned every design decision that he made and guided his whole philosophy of urbanization, if you want. For him, urbanization was predicated around forms of circulation on one hand, but on the other, a sort of radically new, scientifically constructed form of domesticity. So not domesticity as something understandable through an architecture or through architecture per se, but much more, I would argue, as a kind of technology, something which is to be scientifically known and statistically distributed across space. It was the technology in which human beings would reproduce themselves, in which biological diseases could be mediated, and essentially a way through which the whole urbe, the urban, if you want, of Cerdà, could be controlled and regulated constantly. So it's this space that's balanced between all sorts of modes of circulation on one hand, and a technology, I would say a biopolitical technology of domesticity. And all of this would be mediated through what he hoped to be an endless grid of circulation. So this grid of circulation and dwelling, in fact, which is a very abstract grid, would literally stretch across the world, ultimately, for Cerdà, into creating kind of one giant urban space. Because of this, technology played a very crucial role for Cerdà. So movement was always underpinned by the technology of the day, and technology was for Cerdà, as it was for many others after and even before him, seen as a kind of cure-all for all of society's ills, everywhere from disease all the way to political corruption and violence. So in a sense, technology was a kind of Kantian notion which would basically eliminate violence and even the abstraction of politics itself. So in a way, it would replace the state ultimately for Cerda. One other thing that's quite important, when we talk about the boulevards, for example, of Paris, and as well the work that Cerda was looking at, what we can see is actually more than simply new, broader streets that were there, that were meant to sort of to manage the dissident activities of the revolutionary populations of the cities of the 19th century. What I would argue is that we actually start to see the entrance of territory as a category into the city. And what I mean by territory is a kind of political technology that was developed over the course of the previous 2 centuries. So from the 17th century onwards, the epistemology, the knowledge of the state, as well as the technologies that were implemented to actually know the state. So cartography, technologies of construction of roadways, of mapping out the entire the territory of the state. All of this we can understand through the kind of larger category of territory as a political technology of the state. So the boulevards begin to enter into the city, as in Haussmann's Paris, or in some of the regularization efforts of Cerda and many others. What we're actually seeing is a new type of knowledge that had only previously been applied to the spaces of the territory, the landscape constituting the state of Europe, the states of Europe, which had previously always been outside of the city. Suddenly this begins to condition and completely transform the space of the city inside from the 19th century onwards. So in this respect, the city, which has, of course, a very long history in Europe, very long history, begins in the 19th century to be transformed at once by modes of circulation and domesticity, technologies of domesticity, and on the other by these broad new forms of territory that enter in. And the city, in that sense, becomes a kind of epicenter of urbanization. But at the same time, the city, in fact, disappears as a sort of durable space, a kind of idea that we now understand becomes more of a historical artifact of modernity. So the city is replaced by a new space, something completely different and entirely unseen before, which I would call the urban or urbanization. And this space that unfolds out of the city and into the surrounding countryside has a kind of scaleless quality. It's something that I'm trying to argue. So the urban coordinates a kind of single logic of connectivity, circulation, dwelling, that all operate simultaneously at multiple scales and on multiple different forms. So when we say the urban, we tend to think the scale associated to that is something that we might say like the scale of the city, the scale of the urban, somewhere between the scale of the region and the scale of architecture hangs this one thing. But actually what I'm trying to argue is that all of these different ontologies, in fact, are penetrated by a single logic, which is given by urbanization. And I think for architecture to accommodate this new space, it has to become increasingly interchangeable, generic to an extent. And all of these ideas, the scalelessness, the genericness of architecture, the doing away with the city and replacing it with something else, these were all ideas that Cerda had put forward in many of his writings, but in particular the General Theory of Urbanization of 1867. And I think, while that's all fascinating as a historical object, I think the effects of all of this we are now just becoming aware of. So, for example, Neil Brenner and Christian Schmidt are doing work which they call planetary urbanization. We know Ricky Burdett's work, The Endless City, the LSE, and the whole urban age agenda. All of these are programs which are now slowly coming to terms with what is effectively, in my mind, a historically unique space and process that is unfolding across the planet, and it's something that we need, I believe, to get a much stronger kind of theoretical and historical grip on. So that's essentially the kind of work that I'm looking at with my own research. But within the context of this event, I think this is precisely why Price's Fun Palace together, put together with this notion of the stroll, seemed to me to be a very apt kind of provocation. So I'd like to examine this building, the Fun Palace, this project rather, in order to help us understand not only how the rise of urbanization transformed the city or the territory in which it sits, as I've just mentioned, but also how the rise of the urban or the rise of urbanization also transforms the very status of architecture itself. So in other words, Fun Palace can show us how architecture became urbanized. So what does that mean? What is the urbanization of architecture? So I want to just give a very brief analysis of my own, a very kind of empirical, in a way, reading of the Fun Palace. So unfortunately, because this lecture is being done sort of in a recorded sense and transmitted and whatever, I don't have any kind of visual imagery with me. So just want you to kind of bear in mind all the various images that I'm sure you have very close in your imagination at the moment of Cedric Price's Fun Palace. So to kind of help understand what I'm going to describe. So for me, what is the Fun Palace? I think the first thing that I would note about this building, and again, this is typical of many types of radical architectures of the time, the building is siteless. It's a generic building. Basically, it's constructed out of a minimal, extendable grid of structure and circulation. So if you remember the structural cores that it's consisting of are these kind of big structural elements on one hand, but inside of which they have lifts. They connect in with various modes of circulation, of ramps, escalators, travelators, and so on. The only relationship that we can understand between the Fun Palace as a building and what is outside of it is in the actual accommodation of the grid in space. In a sense, there is no relationship between the building and its site, except in the way that the site accommodates its building, if as it were. So in that sense, the architectural consistency of the Fun Palace never somehow lends itself to be understood as architecture per se, but rather its materiality is its minimally distributed grid of structural service columns, allowing it to be kind of located anywhere. So in a sense, it's like one of the walking cities of Archigram in that its relation to the earth or to the ground or to the city or the context or whatever is essentially insignificant or negligible. And as such, it's a formless building. It's obviously a very ephemeral and, in that sense, limitless building, and I'll try to explain that. It's obviously a flexible space, and that's basically the first thing we all know about the Fun Palace, where basically any configuration within its spaces can be installed, taken down, reconfigured, sort of endlessly. And in that sense, the experience was one of constant, perpetually ephemeral, performative, and unrepeatable acts, all of which were kind of based on communication and exchange. So all those kind of technologies were there to make configurations of communication take place. The Fun Palace, in this sense, as Price would argue as well, is not really a building at all, but rather a space of infrastructure. The only fixed element, of course, is the minimal structure itself, and everything is meant to change. And I think in that sense, it's much more of an atmosphere generator, or the space which constructs and mediates various atmospheres, much more so than actually a building. And it would be, as I would call it, a kind of an interior without any enclosure. There's no sort of skin to this building. It's a solid, it's a continuous interior with no limits, in a sense. All these multiple technologies he specified were meant to kind of condition the air, provide different lighting, meant to kind of filter in different ways, and separate the different spaces of the Fun Palace for whatever atmosphere was desired. And this is why I think the Fun Palace in many of Price's drawings appears somewhat invisible or partial. In a sense, we can never see it as a resolved totality as we could with most other types of buildings. And for this reason, for me, it really takes on the quality of limitlessness. It becomes, in this sense, more understandable or legible, if you want, as a background at times disappearing altogether, on which the sort of infinity of human activity is meant to sort of unfold endlessly in the pursuit of fun. We could say, in this sense, the fun palace is more of a milieu. And of course, fun for Price was really the expression of sort of limitlessness, since fun for Price was really measured through the sort of spatial mutability. So through the constant changing of the architectures inside, that was a sort of the way fun was to be produced in a way. And fun for Price, I think we should mention, was really, it was not the sort of notion of jouissance, of just pure expression of enjoyment, but rather it was to be a calculation. There was a science behind fun, based on inputs and outputs, and kind of creating an ever unique configuration of relations through a sort of cybernetic control, if you want, of the notion of fun. And all of this, of course, bears a great sense of sort of technological consistency. So this is all only possible through the sort of cutting-edge technologies that were deployed in the Fun Palace. And in this sense, I think that's what we need to see the Fun Palace as, is a great kind of scaffolding for all the various communication technologies of all sizes, shapes, materials, configurations, and even atmospheres. Again, it's a machine that is cybernetic, and this is new at the time. Price was very influenced by systems theory and was trying to somehow deploy it through architecture. So its users would be sort of questioned at one point, but also the way that the users would be interacting with the space would also be then fed back in to perpetually transform the space inside as a means to service them. And he was very interested in service. And this is really the context in which the Fun Palace presents itself as a theater. And of course, Price's collaboration with Joan Littlewood was in an attempt to create this sort of new type of theater. But for Price, I mean, the question of what kind of theater, I think, is he constructing really comes up here. If technology was meant to create literally any activity that would take place within it, we can also see then how technology was also the object and in a way the center of a certain human performance of communication and exchange. Although I think today it's probably quite easy to see that performance is maybe a slightly romantic term. We all know our relationship to technologies of communication is far less performative and much more, well, I don't know exactly, something not so idealistic perhaps. And throughout this whole project, there's obviously a kind of pedagogical element here. And of course, one thinks of the Potteries Think Belt again as a much more directly engaged pedagogical project. But in this case, the Fun Palace was really meant to encourage a kind of interaction between the users and technology as a way to kind of educate, and this was a very direct ambition of Price's, to educate its users for a kind of immersive life mediated by communication technology. So he really believed that technologies of communication and exchange were the ways in which a kind of social change might be administered. And this was to be done through a constantly changing, because education for Price had to be constant, so too did the machinery of the Fun Palace constantly have to change and create new modalities of exchange and communication. Again, change for Price was equivalent, like the notion of social change for Price was very much equivalent to and based on the constantly changing of technological interfaces with human interaction. A very kind of one-to-one, almost simplistic notion of change there. So for me, this is really the way that I read the Fun Palace. Obviously, there are many different readings we can all make. But for me, it's very interesting again, because it begins to show us something different. And I think typically Price is really praised for his, so-called revolutionary or radical, or at the time, what many people called utopian thought. And in that sense, Fun Palace is really a project that can be thought of as a kind of testament to Price's visionary ideas. But for me, I think what's interesting is that the Fun Palace is something we would best describe not as architecture, again, and I think he would say the same. But it appears as something wholly different, something we could say indicative of a historically new process at work, in the sense that it reveals much more about this process and this context in which it was produced than it necessarily has a certain visionary aptitude that we can credit Price with. So indeed, I think this is the case when we talk about a lot of people, and the same can be said about people like Cerda or Hénard or Howard or many other kind of technophiles of the 19th and 20th century. In a sense, it's not because these figures maybe had such radically novel ideas, and in the sense Price's ideas were really not at all different from those of his colleagues in London like Archigram, or in France like Jona Friedman, or Holland like Constant Newhouse, or even folks in Italy like Archizoom. But really, I think what makes these people interesting, not so much that their thinking so radically departs from the norm, but rather actually because their ideas seem to help concretize ideological constructs that had otherwise gone unrepresented, unrecognized, or unnamed. So in a sense, their work, and I think this is definitely the case with Price and Fun Palace, his work is actually mediating and making concrete or making visual a certain tendency that already exists and it's already in the air. So with this, I want to suggest that the Fun Palace helps us to materialize and visualize in its drawings, in its diagrams, and the words written about it, and so forth, and the discourses that it sort of infuses in its architecture. It helps us to understand the transformations that have been slowly operating within the practice and knowledge of architecture ever since really the late 18th century. And this must be, for me, sometime around the moment Durand began working on the idea of the type, or maybe it's even as early as Pierre Pat's work on the plan total that he had for Paris, or even just the city at large, and the generic street sections and infrastructural work that he began imagining. So in other words, Price's Fun Palace, for me, I think, forces us to create a hypothesis. And that hypothesis would be that if the birth of the urban, as I'm trying to argue, transformed irreversibly the city, then it follows that since the city is an entity whose historical legibility is founded primarily on its architecture, the status of architecture too then must have significantly been transformed. And in a way, if we can't recognize this transformation, because it's a very slow transformation, effectively, if we can't recognize this in everyday architectural knowledge or practice, then I would offer that Price's Fun Palace, in its kind of exaggerated architectural consistency, can really help to make this clear. So in fact, we can understand what the urbanization of architecture, this idea that I'm trying to put out, we can understand what this could mean if we note the similarities between the ideas of the Fun Palace and those of the first great spokesman of the urban himself, Ildefonso Cerda. So just to kind of return to some of the theses that Cerda has, I just want to sort of put this next to the reading that I've made of the Fun Palace and to sort of try to link the two things and to show the similarities between the thinking that goes on. For Cerda, the urban, as I tried to argue, was a system organized around the generic deployment of services across a grid. So the urban, unlike the city, is thus a kind of sightless, almost diagrammatic spatial entity. It's a kind of spatial order that can be constructed anywhere and is meant to be constructed anywhere. Of course, as Cerda wanted, if this urbe, as he called it, would stretch itself around the entire world, it literally had to be sightless because it takes up every site. And in fact, the urban for him was also a formless spatial entity. So the only form that he was willing to commit himself to was that of the isometric grid of infrastructure. It's kind of a form to end all forms, if you want. And according to this understanding, we can argue that there really is no such thing as urban form, which we often refer to. In fact, the only things that would exist would be things like urban densities, connectivities, traffic, urban statistics, demographic, urban change, things that are happening within the urban. The idea of centers for Serdar were anathema. I mean, he believed that centers within an isometric grid could never be predetermined, but could only emerge naturally over time and in multiple locations, and disappear just as readily. So almost like Rem Koolhaas's notion of the red hot spots that would kind of appear and disappear when he was looking at New York City, for example. Again, the urban is scaleless. Another way to understand the urbanization of architecture that I'm talking about is in remembering that the urban is a spatial order not limited to a particular scale, i.e. like the city, but it's a logic, it's a spatial logic, and it's a kind of spatial order built around circulation and management of population somehow. Circulation of things, of people, of objects, but also the management of a kind of domesticated population. So in that sense, it's a logic, in other words, that can just as easily condition a territory, something as large as a territory, several territories even, just as easily as it can also condition a single building. So I think, in a way, it invites us to imagine, just the very notion of scalelessness of the urban should invite us to think that, in fact, anything can be urbanized, in a sense. As such, the urban is really a logic without limits. And again, all of these are certain readings that I'm making of things that Serdar was making explicit. So again, thinking about Serdar, we want to put these ideas in contact with the Fun Palace and the ideas around it. So again, the urban for Serdar was a logic without limits and a space without limits. So in fact, it's a spatial order predicated on a kind of constant expansion, urbanization, urbanization. It's a space made legible not in its limits, in its frontiers, in its enclosures, endpoints or walls or things like this, but rather in what circulates, what communicates, what exchanges. It's a kind of a network logic. So, just like we don't understand the internet as a sort of single enclosed entity, but rather through the things and channels that it opens up, the same can be said about the urban. And this is for this reason I call it a kind of pure interior. It's a space which, to kind of paraphrase, if you want, 12th century theology, it's a space that in which its interior is everywhere and its exterior is nowhere. So it's a pure interior without an exterior, if you want. And like Price, I think Serdar privileged also the user individual, the sort of singular capitalist, if you want. In that sense, technological apparatuses were really all constructed around the circulating, communicating, exchanging individual. And all the kind of calculations and statistics and basically planning and strategic organization of the space of the urbe, of the urban, was really based around this sort of single atomized individual, the bourgeois individual in a way. And I think the last thing to say, this is again, my reading of Serdar, but I think it's very much true, is that the process of urbanization is something we can't see as limited to a kind of spatio-material or spatio-technological transformation. But also, we have to understand that the urban operates on a socio-political constitution of the world. In a sense, because urbanization is a process that both incorporates the technologies of territory, and again, territory is a political technology, and because the urban works as a constant process of territorialization, i.e. it works on the subject, on constructing a new type of subject, we really must understand the urban as both a spatial order, kind of a spatio-technical order, as I've described, but it's also a political form. So in other words, the urban is a kind of political program of modernity which becomes and uses much more, it becomes embedded in and uses space in which to kind of deploy its politics, to control, to manage population, and so forth. And if anyone's familiar with the work of Michel Foucault, for example, around biopolitics, which is a very common notion now, then I think you'll understand exactly what I mean by that. So space itself becomes basically the object and site of a sort of new type of politics that's unfolding around the world, but primarily in Europe in the 19th century and around the world afterwards. And this again is biopolitics. So I think just to sort of begin to conclude, I'd like to kind of put forward then a kind of a very rough sort of thesis here. Obviously, this is this is a test that I'm doing right now, and it's something that isn't exactly a precise argument, let's say, but nevertheless one that I'd like to use to provoke a sort of debate around Price's Fun Palace. But for me, what Fun Palace kind of shows us is that the rise of the urban is not something limited to the indefinite transformation of the city and of the territory in which it sits, but also this idea of the birth of the urban, I think we have to see permanently alters the status of architecture. So architecture too, both in practice and in form, becomes at one point in history, let's say in the 19th century, it became the site of a radical change brought about by the urbanization of the world. Becomes, in a sense, architecture becomes a kind of material abstraction whose condition in the world is known less and less through its kind of material integrity and kind of solidity as a permanent datum of truth, if you want, kind of a Renaissance notion, if you will. But rather, it becomes known more through its kind of connectivity with forms of circulation, with infrastructures of movement, of communication and exchange. Architecture, in that sense, becomes less the sole site of power. It becomes less a kind of domicile, if you want. It becomes less a sort of disciplinary stage from which, let's say, the subject is to be defined in relation to the sovereign and so on. And it becomes much more a kind of qualitatively equivalent node of exchange. So it becomes somehow interchangeable. It becomes a kind of scalable container interface, constantly open to change in terms of program, in terms of use, in terms of movement, all of which can be adapted through the different technologies, the different lighting, the different spatial conditions that we want to create for whatever activity is happening within it. In that sense, architecture is not equivalent to infrastructure, which of course serves it, but its relation to infrastructure becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish at times. So is architecture infrastructure, or is infrastructure also architecture? Well, of course, these are questions we're comfortable with at this point asking, and that don't even seem very provocative, but I think it's still important to think about that. So in this sense, by the urbanization of architecture, what I mean to posit is that also the political possibilities of architecture per se are always already inscribed within a kind of pre-existing diagram of power, material, and circulations and directionalities and so forth, all of which are fastened down and embedded in the sort of greater spatial logic of the urban. So coming back to the Fun Palace in more specifically in terms of the theatrical element, Price's collaboration with Joan Littlewood, I think it reminds us, of course, of, let's say, the early 20th century revolutionary theater of Eisenstein and Tretyakov. And this, of course, I'm making a small reading departure, let's say, into Gerald Browning's A Thousand Machines, a small essay he wrote a few years ago. But I think if we start looking at the two together, we start to understand a bit more about the sort of politics of the Fun Palace, if there are any in a way, and or at least to see the limitations of the politics. Both theaters, let's say, intended obviously to create a radically new idea of theater. The theater of Eisenstein and Tretyakov was understood around this idea of a theater of attractions, as they called it, which attractions were these kind of moments of rupture and surprise in which the sort of barrier that we typically see between the audience and the stage was to be kind of completely broken down, and in a very kind of aggressive way, the audience would be engaged in kind of an autonomous moment in the play, which created a kind of a very different setting from that of the kind of bourgeois theater against which Eisenstein and Tretyakov were kind of reacting. the bourgeois theater, of course, at the time, in the early 20th century, was conditioned by a very totalizing and pedagogical sort of sense of atmosphere and narrative that were meant to sort of drown you in a very singular narrative, a singular way of kind of interacting and understanding theater. And so Eisenstein and Tretyakov had this notion that actually it would be through the theater, what they call the theater of attractions, that they could construct a very radical idea where they actually would not only, as in Brecht, kind of break this barrier between audience and stage, but in fact, by doing so, they would be able to incite revolutionary action. So not only in the theater itself would they start creating, kind of unpredictable and chaotic moments where fistfights would break out in the audience and so forth, but also these activities were intended to, in fact, spill out onto the streets and, in fact, incite a kind of revolution. So obviously, if we understand this theater of attractions of Eisenstein and Tretyakov as a sort of theater of a revolutionary theater, obviously Price's interpretation of theater, understanding it through the Fun Palace, seems far less revolutionary in that sense. And it seems much more, let's say, interested in a kind of theater of technology, where technology, circulation, movement, flexibility, interchangeability, and so on, all become much more the center of a sort of spectacle. It becomes a spectacular theater. And indeed, I think the status of technology here that had really reached such stratospheric heights with not only Price, but all of his kind of British colleagues at the time, really seems to take on an almost kind of autopoietic capacity to basically produce whatever seems necessary. It becomes aimless in a sense, and there is no stated ambition other than to kind of create a constantly regenerating moment. And I think this was all captured very precisely in the sort of sardonic title that Price gave to a lecture of 1966, in which he called it the technology. He said, "Technology is the answer, but what was the question?" So it's kind of sarcastic, tongue-in-cheek title, but I think really captures, again, not only Price's attitude about technology and about politics, but also all of his colleagues, Archigram and so forth. And in fact, I think it is here where really the politics of the urban, again, recalling what we were just talking about, begin to reveal themselves in and through Price's Fun Palace, through the sort of cybernetic feedback loops and user interfaces that constitute, in a sense, the basis of the entire project. So again, fun, like all other states of human behavior, is ever more to be kind of rendered through data, which is then subjected to the same sort of biopolitical calculus of control, predictability, statistics, and so on, and mediated then through technologies of communication and circulation back to the very same users who are producing this kind of thing. And all of this, I think, constitute a kind of core of the material social experience of the Fun Palace. Really, the Fun Palace, in a sense, operates as a kind of assemblage of technology and social reform that we start to see today enacted in discourses like the Smart City program or parametric urbanism and so forth. And I think very much like the liberals of the 19th century who believed that technology would radically equalize the world, again, the isometric grid of Serda was like in Price's case, in the same sense that he saw change as being equivalent to the actual change of space and architecture. Serda, if we recall, saw equality as the equal distribution of equally spaced domestic units across an equally spaced grid of circulation. So it's kind of very simplistic collapsing of space and into kind of a political program is happening here. And again, so as the liberals of the 19th century believed technology would kind of equalize the world, would kind of eliminate violence and make politics itself redundant, Price too seemed to have been intoxicated with the very same promise of technology to really displace the political transformation with the soft and kind of ambiguous notion of change. So instead of asking the very difficult question of, how do we really enact political transformation, Price would answer the question through a sort of a notion of change enacted through architectural movement. But I think, as with liberals like Serda, Price's belief in technology's capacity for social reform would really only ever cover over the increasing political reach and actually effective subjugation that all the same technologies that he was talking about of communication, atmospheric production, and spatial experience, through the sort of reach that they have always had or have had ever since, only ever became kind of ever more, let's say, deep. So in a sense, his belief in technology, his sort of intoxication with it, in a sense, covered this grasp of technology's control as a sort of mode of political control. It basically covered this over. In that sense, the Fun Palace, just like what we could talk about the urban as a sort of spatial logic at large, is more than a kind of assemblage of architectures. No, the Fun Palace is really a kind of political technology. It's a machinic assemblage whose success is based precisely on its use of communication, exchange, and circulation deployed in open, flexible, and ever-changing spatio-social configurations. Both, I think, the urban and the Fun Palace, in a sense, work to constantly subjectify and desubjectify and then resubjectify life itself, ensnaring it in a kind of cybernetic relation of what Felix Guattari has called at one point, enslavement. So operating precisely within the production of desire, emotion, cognitive and linguistic behaviors, perceptual and affective responses, a type of enslavement takes place that operates as a form of kind of political control ultimately. And it's really through this kind of openness and, in fact, this instability and unpredictability that Price prescribes for the Fun Palace that what we can talk about as a kind of machinic assemblage has really become a kind of prominent and efficient paradigm of modern power, this kind of cybernetic mode of power that I think we start to slowly understand more and more in an everyday sense today, acting to both subjectify and to enslave individuals. And I think, as Marito Lazzarato has shown, the subject is, in this sense, is constituent precisely through language and communication, not outside or prior to it. So it's really this kind of technologies that are part of a much greater political machine at work that perhaps Price is unaware of. And I think the sort of glibness that he uses in a title like Technology is the Answer, but what was the question? I think this kind of glibness reveals not only a sort of political nonchalance that Price and, again, many of his colleagues in England had at the time, but it also shows that the spectacle produced by such a phrase is enough to cover over a rather uninteresting, unprovocative, and in fact hackneyed set of ideas that underpin it.